times, return to God's word. And we turn again to the book of Ezra. And we find ourselves in chapter 8. Ezra chapter 8. I read a couple of verses in a moment, but just a word of recap. The last occasion, we looked at the first 20 verses of the chapter, which are taken up, about 2/3 of them are taken up with a list of names. And we saw really two things. We saw that there were some notable people present, and we began to dig into some of these names a little. But we also saw that there were some notable people absent. Ezra must have been somewhat disappointed when the people gathered at this central point, which was the place they were gathering to as they prepared to then set off on their journey, to realize how few of the Levites he had present. They just weren't there. They had not responded to the call to go up to Jerusalem. Now that was a problem, because Ezra had a fair amount of material with him for the service of the temple. But the service of the temple without the Levites simply wasn't possible. So he really needed to have at least some Levites with him in order to advance the work in Jerusalem. And you remember we saw that he decides to have another attempt, and someone is sent, a group are sent to a certain place where there appear to be quite a lot of Levites living, and they meet with them, and the end result is that they come back with 38 Levites and 220 Nethinims, or temple servants. So no doubt we're never satisfied anyway, are we? But no doubt Ezra would have liked to have more Levites, but 38 was a decent start, and 220 Nethinim would certainly prove very useful. So they now arrive, so that's another 258, isn't it, at the river Ahava there. So they're all gathered, and you can just imagine they must have had lots of different emotions and thoughts. There were families, there were children there. You know, when we gather, tend not to do Sunday school outings as much now, we tend to do it more locally based, but you remember when we would, and when we do, and those of you who we all know what children are like, and when they would gather, they'd be really excited. Now, they might just be going not very far away, in Britain or whatever, and it wasn't like they were going to the other side of the world, but for the children it might as well have been. You know, there was a palpable sense of excitement. Well, for the people there, they weren't quite going to the other side of the world, but they were going to undertake some journey, and their lives were going to be different. From that day forward, they were beginning a whole new life. So they're gathered there. What does Ezra do next? Verse 21. Ezra chapter 8, reading at 21. Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might afflict ourselves before our God, to seek of him a right way for us, and for our little ones, and for all our substance. For I was ashamed to require of the king a band of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy in the way, because we had spoken to the king, saying, the hand of our God is upon all them for good that seek him, but his power and his wrath is against all them that forsake him. So we fasted and besought our God for this, and he was intreated of us. Well, as we come to this section, to these verses, I want to divide it into 4 parts. I want us to begin, first of all, by thinking for a minute about the challenges of the journey, the challenges of the journey. I said a moment ago that it was a life-changing moment for them. It certainly was. But the journey itself was by any measure hazardous. There's Ezra with the responsibility of several thousand Jews, all of them inexperienced in travel. It is unlikely that any of them had ever gone far from where they were in Persia. Travel in those days was not as easy or as hard, and they would have had little reason to go anyway. So it is likely that they were inexperienced in travel. They had never covered this area before. It wasn't like they knew the road like the back of their hand. It's all new. Every mile of that road would be new. Every corner that they would come to, they didn't know what lay ahead. They were going to have to go about 1,000 miles. Well, about 900 miles, the route we reckon that they took. Now, I was pondering that actually this morning, and I was thinking, what's 900 miles from here? So I did a quick Google. London apparently is 621 miles from Skeabost. So they're going to have to go further than that. So that what I found was about 900 miles was Paris. Paris from here is 913 miles apparently. So it was as if you were going to travel from here to Paris on foot with a company of people. So, let's not have rose-tinted spectacles on. It was lovely, and it was wonderful, and they were going to do a good thing. But dear me, they had quite a task in front of them. And there is Ezra carrying, humanly speaking, the leadership and the burden of all of this. Now, Ezra was not a soldier. He was a scribe. He was a priest. He was a scholar. He was all of these things. But what a thought it must have been for him as he set off. And to make matters more complicated, they were carrying a small fortune in silver and gold with them. We saw that in one of the previous chapters. They had a huge amount of silver and gold, several tons of it, in fact. And what were they doing? They were going through territory that was absolutely notorious for highwaymen, robbers, and brigands. They would lie by the way, they would watch people coming, and humanly speaking, they would be able to tear apart this group in no time at all. And if the rumor spread that this group was carrying a small fortune in silver and gold, they would be like bees to a people. The time they were going at was also rather difficult. The political situation in the western regions of the empire at this point were very unsettled. There was a great deal of movement of people and a good deal of danger and difficulty as well. Law and order, such as it was even poorer than normal. So all of this falls on this man's shoulder. He's responsible for gold and silver, for families, for groups, including little children. What a burden. What a challenge. What a journey. And as we think of the Christian and as we think of the Christian church in this world, what challenges, what dangers, what difficulties confront you, Christian, on your journey, to use Bunyan's words, from the city of destruction to the celestial city, and Bunyan himself leaves us in no doubt. He's fighting here and he's struggling there. If it's not Apollyon, it's hill difficulty or something else. Well, so it is. There's a real danger of attack and ambush. Now, perhaps in the providence of God, this group that Ezra was leading might manage to pass through every inch of that territory unnoticed, under the radar, as we see. It's not impossible. They might manage to get through the 900 odd miles and not a single robber, not a single brigand even notices that they're there. It's not impossible. But for the church, it is impossible. There is no way that they are going to get on their journey from the city of destruction to the celestial city unnoticed. Unnoticed by the enemy, unnoticed by the word, unnoticed by Satan. Of course not. Their every move is watched. He's behind every rock and every bush along the way. A warring lion seeking whom he may devour. The greatest robber of all is on alert. And he knows that you carry precious things. Say more about that maybe next time, in the next section, but he knows that you carry precious things. And oh, he hates you with that deep hate, because he hates your master. Ambushing, robbing, spoiling, hurting, wounding, absolutely. Now, perhaps the Lord in his providence would allow the group to go unchallenged all the way to Jerusalem. But the Lord won't in the case of his church, because challenge and difficulty is necessary. So it's the challenges of the journey. Now, with all these challenges and all these dangers, the question comes up, could Ezra get a military escort of some sort? That would be quite handy, quite good. Even a dozen soldiers would go some way to help him. You could get a few dozen, all the better. The challenge of the journey. That leads us, secondly, to an escort for the journey. An escort of soldiers. You know the way it is. Important people are given an escort. Police escort for certain people and clears the way and guards them. Well, an escort might have been available. We've given the impression that if Ezra had asked for it, he would have been provided with it. And if you remember, when Nehemiah went up to Jerusalem some years later, he was given an escort. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 9. Then I came to the governors beyond the river. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. Nehemiah wanted an escort. He got an escort. Captains of the army. How did it put it there? Yeah, captains of the army and horsemen. An escort. Humanly speaking, it seemed almost essential. We're told in verse 22 that Ezra doesn't want to ask for an escort. Look at verse 22. It was a shame, and we'll come back to that word in a moment, to require of the king a band of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy in the way. He tells us that he was ashamed to ask. Now, why was he ashamed to ask? What's going on here? Well, he tells us, look at the verse again. Because we had spoken to the king, saying, the hand of our God is upon all them for good that seek him, but his power and his wrath is against all them but forsaken. Ezra felt that asking for a military escort would dishonor the Lord in the eyes of this pagan king. He has told the king that God was able to guard and able to keep him, that God's hand was over his people, and that he was able to deal with all their enemies, every robber that might be on that road. He had said, "Our God, O Emperor, is the only living and true God." Then Ezra's got a problem. He's saying, how then can I go and ask him for a military escort? There was a danger that it would look as though he didn't believe what he said. And it could lead the king to suspect one of two things, actually. Either God's power to help his people, or Ezra's confidence in God's power. So he concludes, don't ask for an escort at all. Two good men, Ezra and Nehemiah. But they take very different positions on the question of a military escort. It's a problem for one. Doesn't appear to be an issue for the other. And incidentally, Paul was quite happy for a Roman military escort from Jerusalem to Caesarea. You can read about it in Acts 23. In fact, there were several hundred in that military escort. He had no difficulty with it. Where Nehemiah and Paul, less spiritual than Ezra. You noticed my hesitation before I even said it. Well, who's going to accuse either of them of a lack of spirituality? I'm certainly not. And neither is there a hint in either passage that the one is being put up against the other. But they do take a different approach. They take a different approach. Now, some people try to get out of this. And they claim that the two groups were different, that Ezra was leading a spiritual group, while Nehemiah was going on an official service. Now, there's a grain of truth in that. There is a grain of truth in that. But it's not really, well, I'm certainly not convinced. Not about you. I'm not convinced. Because Ezra is also going as the king's representative. We saw that last week or the previous week. That he's going as the king's official representative in the area beyond the river. It wasn't just a religious pilgrimage. It was certainly that. It seems to me that suggestion is just an attempt to find a way around it. And I'm not convinced, but I leave that with you. But what we have, we don't need to make it complicated. What we have are two godly men who come to two different conclusions. For one, a certain course of action in a certain time, in a certain place, will involve the danger of compromise and a spoiling of his testimony. For the other, in a certain place, at a certain time, the same thing causes no difficulty. It is possible, friends, for two believers to come to two different conclusions as to their duty. And tolerance is required. Not if one or t'other is going against biblical principle. That's a given. But if no biblical principle is involved, then a certain amount of tolerance and freedom and liberty of conscience must be allowed. Romans chapter 4 and verse 4. Anyway, the verse I'm looking for was that verse where Paul speaks of, I know what it is. It's Romans 14. Yeah, Romans 14 and verse 4. To his own master, he stands or falls. To his own master, he stands or falls. And Paul there is dealing with the eating of meat and all that, so the complicated situation that was there. Let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not. Let not him that eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received it. Who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. And I think that New Testament principle that Paul is applying there has an Old Testament illustration here in the different approaches of these two men. Each situation is different, and there are times, there are times that demand that faith must take on the flesh and depend on God alone. And it appears that as far as Ezra was concerned, this was one of these times. He's not finding fault with Nehemiah. It may well have been Ezra that wrote the book of Nehemiah. Not finding fault with him. But he's saying, that occasion, as I stood before God, I concluded it wasn't right to ask for a military escort. God's honor in his mind was at stake in a way that perhaps it wasn't at the time of Nehemiah. And where God's honor is involved, the Christian needs to act in such a way as to defend that at all costs. So Ezra, he refuses the idea of an escort. His whole approach to Jerusalem and to the journey is a spiritual one. I was pondering today, he's not in Hebrews 11. Lots who aren't in Hebrews 11, but I was thinking, about just the way he would fit into Hebrews 11. By faith, Ezra declined to request the emperor for soldiers, trusting entirely in the Lord for his journey. Well, some people might say, a bit of bravado, isn't it? He's taking a risk. Children, families. It wasn't bravado, because the third thing was prayer and fasting before the journey. Prayer and fasting before the journey. He's not got Levites to go with him. That'll help him on the journey. It'll help him on Jerusalem, but it's of no avail except the Lord goes with him. And all the manpower in the world couldn't replace that. Indeed, supposing he had a military escort, as we were singing earlier, except the Lord build the house, except the Lord keep the city, the watchmen watch in vain. Oh, he has a military escort, a heavenly military escort. That's what he's trusting. the Lord and his power and his angelic host guard them mile after mile up that dangerous road. That is what we need, the power and the grace of God. So Ezra sets aside 3 days to seek God's protection. Now, I'm going to deal with this fairly quickly. I want to notice 3 things very quickly. First of all, it was all done on the basis of covenant. Where are we? Verse 21. Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might afflict ourselves before our God. It's our God that he is afflicted, that he is coming to. And are you sure that the Lord will keep you on the way to Jerusalem? Because he's our God. Because we are his, and he is ours. And we are secure in that covenant. I have a confidence, I have a certainty that is unshakable. Our friends, your God is a covenant God, a covenant keeping and a covenant making God, a God of grace. Howard Kelly was a poor boy. He had to pay fees if he was going to attend school. So he would go from door to door selling little things to make a bit of money. He was hungry. He had almost no money left. He decided the next door he was going to knock at, he was going to ask for some food. So he knocked the door, and a young woman came to the door. But his courage failed him. So he just asked her for a drink of water, a cup of water. He wasn't brave enough to ask for more. But she came back, and she had a large glass of milk. He offered her a few pennies for it, and she said, no, not at all. Many years passed, and the woman became ill. None of the local doctors knew what was wrong. They couldn't actually do anything for her. So they sent her to the hospital in the big city. Little Howard Kelly has now grown up, and he's one of the doctors in the big hospital. In the providence of God, he was asked to go and examine this woman who's been referred from somewhere down the line. He went into his room. He must have had her address. He would probably have a note of the address. Oh, he knew at once who she was. This was a woman who'd given him the glass of water, of milk, that day, years before, when he'd been at the door. He wanted to do his best to cure the woman, and he did actually. After a long time and a couple of complicated procedures, with God's help, she became very well again. But the woman now had another problem. Would she be able to pay the medical fees? Hospital treatment was not free. She didn't have much money. Dr. Kelly actually went by the room with her bill, and he dropped it on the table, and she wept. But she couldn't bring herself to look at it. Couldn't bring herself. What is this going to say? Well, at last she did. And she saw written on the bottom, paid in full with 1 glass of milk. Signed, Dr. Howard Kelly. He had not forgotten her kindness to him when he was so poor. And in the same way, friends, and in a far greater way, Christ extends kindness and grace to those who are his and to those who trust in him. And all that they need for the journey is paid already. Not because of us, but because of him. How are you sure, Ezra? Because he's our God. That's how I know. I know him. And that's enough. And it was all done in humility. My time is gone. It was all done in humility. There's this confession of sin. They afflict themselves, we're told in verse 21. They had nothing to be proud about. And it was all done seeking guidance. You know, there would be decisions to be made on that journey. They needed God's help. They needed God's help. They wouldn't have a pillar of fire or a pillar of cloud like their ancestors had. But he's praying to the Lord, Lord, keep us safe, guard us, bring us on, bring us to the end of our journey. Grant that everything will go well. And they demonstrate by fasting that they were in earnest about it all. Prayer and fasting before the journey. My fourth point, and I've run out of time, was thanksgiving after the journey. But we'll tie that in next time with an expressions, because it will fit in well in that section. Well, may the Lord bless his word from me tonight. Eternal Lord, we seek thy blessing and assistance upon us. Grant that we may know thy blessing on us and with us now, pardoning sin, receiving us free, for Jesus' sake. Amen.